welcome. Good evening. Thank you for being here. My name is Daria Hall, and I'm a board member with xMinds, the Partnership for Extraordinary Minds, and the chair of our BIPOC committee, which hosts these monthly People of the Global Majority discussion opportunities. And we're really happy to be introducing our guest speaker of the night, Mr. Floyd Branch. But first, a few housekeeping rules. Feel free to please keep yourself on mute. There will definitely be moments throughout the presentation where you can come off mute and ask your question directly, or you can use the chat function that's available through Zoom. I also wanted to flag that there is a Spanish translator on the call should you need access to that service. It's a special audio that you would click as you're coming in for Espanol. All right. With that said, as you may know from our promotion about this event, in 2021, a bill was passed to train MCPS teachers on how to de-escalate situations with students, choosing mediation of conflicts instead of resorting to a higher level of discipline. And so restorative justice is now a major practice all throughout MCPS that is there to help all kids be successful throughout their school experience. And this evening, we're really happy to have Mr. Floyd Branch III. Mr. Branch has been in education for 16 years. He obtained his bachelor's degree in liberal arts from Middlebury College in Vermont as a scholar of the Posse Foundation. He previously served as a special education teacher with the New York City Department of Education for 8 years. During this time, he earned his master's degree in special education from the City College of New York. Upon moving to Maryland in 2014, he was hired by the Maryland State Education Department as a resource teacher at the Waxter's Children's Center in Laurel, Maryland. And in 2015, he was offered a position as a 6th grade special education teacher at Francis Scott Middle School, which is part of MCPS. During his time at Key Middle School, he also served as a team leader and supervisor of the special education department. This year, he is serving as an instructional specialist for restorative justice within the Montgomery County Public Schools system, supporting Walter E. Johnson, Quince Orchard, John F. Kennedy, Zadok E. Magruder, and Montgomery Virtual Academy clusters. So we are very happy to have Mr. Branch, who I know is going to pull up his presentation now. Again, if you have any questions along the way, please do feel free to drop them in the chat. And there will be opportunities for a small group this evening where you can come off mute and ask your question directly. But again, thank you for joining us, and over to you, Mr. Branch.
So good evening, everyone. I want to start by saying thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for this platform. I come into this space as a parent of 2 children with IEPs, of 2 special education students. I come into this space as a special education teacher. I come into this space as an advocate. So a lot of the work that I do, I don't just do it because it's a job, but I do it because it's something I'm passionate about. So I like to have authentic conversations that are real, right? And a lot of times, you know, we want to stay politically correct, but I do ask that if there are questions that you guys have, if there are specific instances and you're like, hey, I don't really want to talk about this online, I will definitely put my information in the chat, and feel free to reach out to me by email, by phone. And when I say that, I mean it. I've built a lot of relationships over the years, whether it be through New York public education school system or Maryland MCPS. And I mean what I say. So please feel free to ask questions when the time comes. And again, this is about giving you guys the opportunity to learn a little bit more about the work of restorative justice and seeing how it can benefit our students as a whole. So the title of our presentation tonight is called Restorative Justice and xMinds. How do we create those win-win situations for parents, caregivers, and guardians? So our objectives tonight, we're going to do a little bit of mindfulness. This is something you may have heard of. It is something that is becoming more and more prevalent in our schools. There are even PDO sessions, which are professional development opportunities for staff on mindfulness. We're going to talk a little bit about the what and the why behind restorative justice, or RJ. You heard a little bit about why the bill was passed. What are some of the things you need to know about RJ as it pertains to your children and their schools? The current state of RJ and MCPS. How do we use restorative practices for repairing harm from a restorative discipline lens? Look at a scenario too, just kind of like how would RJ be used in this particular instance? And then of course, it wouldn't be right without giving you guys some tips and strategies to take away to implement at home. And again, throughout the presentation, we will have time for questions and concerns. This is my email. I will also put it in the chat later for you guys, but please feel free to copy and paste it, put it in the email, in the chat, sorry. And please feel free to email me if you have any questions, concerns, if you want to talk offline. Again, this is my email, and I'm definitely adamant about responding to emails. Oftentimes when it be, whether I'm working with families, whether I'm working with staff, a quote helps to shape our mindset and frame the learning that we're going to engage in tonight. The strength of our student relationships makes the difference in translating our passion to teaching into their passion for learning. When students are going into a space, whether it be a classroom or school building, where they feel loved, valued, and cared for, when they feel somebody understands them, it makes the difference in them wanting to go to school. It makes the difference in them wanting to be there and be present. So the goal is to understand how this work of restorative justice creates these opportunities for students to have those trusted adults in the building. Because we know as parents and caregivers, we can't be there all the time. We can't be there every second of the day. So we want to make sure that they have an opportunity to feel the love that we would give them from somebody else. As I said earlier, mindfulness is something that's becoming more and more prevalent in our schools. Mindfulness is basically a moment to just de-escalate, a moment to stop and breathe. And we know that oftentimes, whether it be because of a comment that was made, whether it be because they're not understood, whether it be because something happened at recess, our children can be elevated, right? So even though they're children, they have strong and big emotions. And mindfulness is a way for them to take a moment to breathe, press pause, and give them space to process their feelings. This presentation, which will also be shared with you, when you click on this image, it takes you to a link of mindfulness for kids. And these are a bunch of strategies, a bunch of things that can be implemented at home. And again, these are things that we want to help and build the toolkit of our students so that when they are in these stressful situations, when they are in these moments where they're elevated, how can they de-escalate? And the most powerful part of this is that they're going to be able to say to their teacher, I need to take a 10-second break and breathe. Can I please have space? And that's the goal, right? That's the goal, that we help our children advocate for their needs. So this is definitely a resource and a tool that I stand by and that can be utilized to support students. So what we are going to do now is we are going to engage in our own mindful moment to just kind of see what the experience is like. So if you are comfortable, what I'm going to ask is that you take a minute to just close your eyes. If you are not comfortable and you just want to visualize this process, that is fine as well, just to kind of see what the experience is like. If you're comfortable, you're going to close your eyes. And in closing your eyes, you are going to have a visual image of a place, a mental image of a place that brings you peace, a place that brings you calm, and a place that brings you happiness. And in this place that you're visualizing, whether that be the beach, whether that be your couch, right? Whatever that space is, we're going to ask that you hold the image of that space. And when I click the play button, you're going to hear prompts. The first prompt is going to be a signal to breathe in. We're going to hold that breath. And then when you hear the chime, you are going to breathe, slowly breathe out and exhale and release that breath. So if everyone's ready, we'll begin. If you're comfortable, your eyes are closed. If you visualize, if you want to watch this opportunity, feel free. Then your lungs are filling up with air. Breathe out. Breathe in. Slowly exhale. Breathe out. And coming out for our last cycle, breathe in. Hold that breath. Slowly breathe out. So, and now you can open your eyes. So something as simple as that 30-second activity of breathing in and breathing out can help to, one, pace your heart a little bit, 2, helps to release your mind from whatever you're holding on to or whatever you're upset about. And 2, it helps you to de-escalate. So again, something that is so powerful, it takes 30 seconds of our day. And if these are tools and strategies that we can implement with our students, the sky is the limit. So to start us off as an icebreaker, if one of these candies had to go, if there was one of these that you're like, I can do without for the rest of my life, which one would it be? So feel free to come off of mute and say your pick, or if you want to put it in the chat, that's fine as well. If there was one of these that had to go, what would it be? Kit Kat, oh, strong choice. Milky Way, interesting. Twix, oh, definitely not a fan of the left and the right I see on the Twix. All right, so I'm gonna say this, and I hope it doesn't turn heads on this one. For me, it would have to be Reese's Peanut Butter Cup. Like if that was the one that had to go, it would be that. Like as I've gotten older, it's something about peanut butter in my bite that does not work well together. So that would be the one for me that would definitely have to go. It's funny. A lot of times kids are like, man, M&Ms are nasty. I'm like, M&Ms, I grew up on M&Ms. Like those are classic. But it's also a sign of the times with the generation. So thank you guys for participating in that icebreaker. If you want to change your decision, if you want to come off a mute one last moment, you can, feel free. Just to get an idea of kind of some of our likes and dislikes. So now we're going to get into a little bit about what restorative justice is and is not, essentially. And in this, we're going to press pause after a couple of slides and take some questions. But when we think about restorative justice, the one thing I always talk to, whether it be parents, staff, administrators, is that it's not a book you go on Amazon and buy. It's nothing that's a curriculum that says day 1, lesson 1. It's all about what's our mindset and what's our philosophy as we engage and work with kids every day. When we think about restorative justice, we're thinking about how are we creating a sense of community, that home away from home? How are we putting our students and our staff in a position for self-care to ensure that our students are in a space to learn? And then lastly, when conflict happens, when conflict arises, how are we creating safe opportunities for students to engage in peaceful discussions around some of the harm that's been caused or some of the hurt that's been caused without feeling like they have to do it on their own and get into physical altercations? Essentially, when we think about restorative justice, we're thinking about a social platform that allows students to actively engage in problem solving, right? Like they're consistently analyzing the world around them to say, hey, this is how this situation makes me feel. Or, hey, I really love being a part of this environment and here's why. In those instances when harm does occur, whether it's intentional or unintentional, how do we get students to take responsibility for their actions? How do we get them to, one, appreciate the perspective and opinion of somebody else if it differs from them, but also to say, hey, I'm sorry that happened and I'm sorry I did that. And then lastly, once we've acknowledged some of that harm, once we've worked to bring people to the table together, how are we repairing relationships? Whether it be from student to student, family to school, teacher to student, how are we creating these opportunities to restore and repair relationships to create that sense of balance and that sense of harmony? I think about my own children, and when my children come home and say, Daddy, I had a bad day because this happened to me, or I had a bad day because somebody yelled at me. For me, I'm thinking about, okay, what's the harm that's been done? How is my child processing this information? And what are we going to do to repair, right? Because those things are what's going to be important. The worst thing in the world is for a child to feel like they're in an environment, in a classroom setting with people that don't care about them. And what we want to do is make sure that when that harm happens, when that hurt happens, that we are working to repair some of those relationships that have been damaged. So when we think about restorative justice, the aim is strong restorative schools, right? 80 to 90% of this work should focus on preventative methods. And we're going to come to a diagram in a little bit, but those preventative methods are how am I building community, whether it be within the classroom, whether it be in the school. What am I doing to understand my kids beyond their test scores, beyond their name, beyond their ID number? right? Because a lot of times we know that we just know the history of the kid, but we don't know the kid. What preventative measures are we taking to support and know our kids for who they are, not what we hear about them in the staff lounge? Oftentimes, restorative justice is used as a reactive measure, and that's not the purpose of the program. Yes, restorative justice can be used to repair harm and hurt, but at the end of the day, it's about our philosophy and about how we're engaging in this work with kids. When we think about the philosophy, it's, am I willing as a classroom teacher, as an educator, to give my class a little piece of myself? How am I letting them know who I am? And what additional strategies, supports, and efforts am I making to make sure they feel affirmed, valued, and included, right? Exclusivity never works. When kids are excluded, when kids are told to, hey, go over to that Carmen corner because you're upset right now, right? It's used as an exclusionary measure as opposed to an inclusive measure. So the goal of this restorative work is to create this inclusive setting, these inclusive environments, so that students, whether they have an IEP or whether they don't, feel included in the classroom setting and they feel like they have somebody who has their back. So from a county perspective, and this is referring to Montgomery County Public Schools, we know that it oftentimes takes about 5 years to fully implement a program. This is year 3 of the Restorative Justice Initiative. It began during the last year of virtual learning during the pandemic. This is the 2nd year in person for our secondary schools. So that's our high schools and our middle schools. This is the 1st year for our elementary schools. One thing that has been done, which is a great step in the right direction, is that every school has funding for our on-site RJ coach. So what does that mean? Every school, all 210 schools in Montgomery County have an RJ coach, meaning they have somebody who is in the building, on the ground, working to implement a lot of this philosophy and this approach to the work that the teachers are doing in the building. Additionally, there are 8 instructional specialists, including myself, who support different clusters of schools. So as shared earlier, I support the Walter Johnson, Kennedy, Magruder, and Quince Orchard clusters. I also support the Montgomery Virtual Academy. I also support my colleagues with their schools. So if they're having if they need support with a situation at their school, I will also support with that. And then lastly, all schools are supported with monthly professional development. So each of our RJ coaches from the 210 schools participate in monthly professional learning communities to learn about restorative practices in other schools and turnkey some of those strategies and supports into their own schools as well. So when we think about restorative justice, we're thinking about what is our commitment and our focus to our children. What I want to do now is take about a minute or two, and I want to give everybody the opportunity to read this on their own. Take about 30 seconds. And after you read this, I'm going to ask that you do one or two things. First, you can either come off of mute and share a phrase that resonates with you, a phrase that stands out, and it values something that is important to you, or you can add it in the chat. So take about 30 seconds to read this. And once you're done reading it, either come off of mute and share something that stands out to you. And if you want to explain why, that's fine. Or if you want to add it in the chat, a phrase that stands out to you, that's fine as well. So again, please feel free to share out. If you want to come off of mute and just share a phrase that resonates with you. If you want to type it in the chat, that's fine as well. This is definitely an opportunity for us to engage as a learning community together. And one thing that was added into the chat by Ms. Hall was the phrase prioritizing the needs of all children, right? One of the things that Ms. Hall and I talked about when she first heard about some of this work that I've been doing is, how does this relate to special education students, right? Like how does this support our students who are sometimes overlooked, right? all children matter, right? Whether they are a student with autism, whether they're a student with a learning disability, every student matters, whether they're a general education student, special education student, all students should have the same experience at school. For me, a phrase that stands out is creating the conditions for learning that allow them, meaning our kids, to show up in their full humanity, right? A lot of times, one thing that I found early in my career, and I even work with teachers now, is that, and I apologize for that, we can't have students conform to who we want them to be, right? We have to give them the space to mature and to develop, and we have to support them along the way. I like to use the phrase, we have to meet them where they are. And all of our children come to our schools and come into our spaces with their own belief system, with their own strengths, but also their own areas of growth. And our teachers have to be able to meet them where they are so that they're showing up as who they are, not who we want them to be. And again, if there's anything else that you want to add, meaning coming off of mute or adding it to the chat, feel free.
Mr. Branch, I think also for me, it's the impacted by multiple systems of power and oppression. Mm-hmm. that recognition also of a lot of the obstacles or the barriers that have to be dismantled in order for there to be greater fairness in systems.
Thank you. Thank you for highlighting that. That's so important. Right. And as parents of children with special education services, oftentimes, right, our children are excluded, right? Like our children are not given that opportunity, that priority that other students might be. So how are we dismantling that system of oppression and that system of exclusion is so important in this work that we're doing. And advocacy and education is part of it. So when we think about restorative justice and restorative practices, we're thinking about three foundational pieces. We're thinking about building community. How are we strengthening those relationships? One of the most powerful things you can hear a child say is, that's somebody in the building I trust. That's a trusted adult, right? Somebody that I know is going to have my back. Because again, as parents, we're not always there. Our kids are spending 7.5 hours a day at school. And we want to make sure that they have somebody in the building who they can go to. Somebody who's going to have their back regardless of who they are or what it may seem they appear to be. Second pillar that is self-care. How are we reducing, preventing, and improving harmful behaviors? How are we putting our students in spaces to learn so that they can be successful? When students are forced to be in a space where they feel like they're not cared for, forced to be in a space where they feel like nobody's looking out for them, forced to be in a space where they feel like nobody likes them, learning is not happening. The physical being is there, but not the mental piece. And we want to make sure our students are able to show up again in their full capacity. And then lastly is, how do we create these opportunities for resolving conflict? How do we create these opportunities that when something arises, when somebody's not happy, when somebody feels harmed, that one, they have a voice to speak up on that. Two, somebody's listening, right? Because a lot of times we know our children keep things in and they feel like I can't say anything because nobody's listening to me, right? How do we create those opportunities for them to be able to have a voice? So what I want to do now is I'm going to press pause for a minute, about a minute or two. We've been through a lot of content so far. Does anybody have any questions? Any initial ideas, any initial thoughts, any feedback? You can come off of mute and say it. You can put it in the chat.
Thank you, Mr. Branch, for this. It's very, very important to us. And I'm nervous in bringing this concern I have into this space. We have not had the experience of restorative justice in school that I am seeing you present. And my daughter with a disability has been told to leave the room because of behaviors related to her disability. So if she's overwhelmed by an assignment
Mm-hmm.
and has a noisy outburst in the classroom, she is taken out and fills out a worksheet by herself. And that doesn't sound at all like what you're presenting. And it fills her with shame about her disability because she doesn't know how to prevent her behaviors as they're made manifest in these moments of stress.
Mm-hmm.
What is being done to deepen the understanding of the practitioners in the schools to reduce shame, to deliver positive interventions to help prevent the behaviors? That what I'm seeing here is that it's supposed to be preventive. And when I asked in an IEP meeting about, can you do something different? She really hates doing this worksheet and she's excluded from the class, and then she misses class, and then she has more behavior because she's missed class. And I'm sorry to make this so personal, but I know that this is what other students in her program, which is a segregated program, are also experiencing, because the kids find it aversive, as she has asked them. Why is it so wildly different from school to school and perhaps program to program as to preventive and positive measures that are put in place so that we don't have to resort to pulling kids out and isolating them when they have a disability, which can already be so isolating?
So
sorry,
thank you.
No, a lot of
you're fine. You're fine. And then, Mr. Cook, I did see your question in the chat. I'm going to come to that. You never apologize for being a parent, right? And you never apologize for being an advocate. So we will talk after this offline about the school and talk about some strategies. There are some things that MCPS is now doing from our input to assure accountability, right? There's a difference between doing something to check a box and there's doing something for accountability. One thing that we have done is we have asked all schools in Montgomery County, all 210, to complete a rubric, which came down from MSDE. And that rubric was basically asking questions of how are you implementing restorative practices in your schools, right? Like, what are you doing to be held accountable for this law that is not Montgomery County law, but is state law? So that's the first measure that's being done, where schools have to be a little reflective in the work that they're doing. The second piece of this is, as RJ instructional specialists, we have become more intentional to supporting and ensuring that schools are communicating this work that's being done to school communities and to parent meetings, whether it be through a PTA meeting, whether it be through a Zoom, for example, something like this. I know I've done the majority of the PTA meetings I've engaged in around restorative justice work is at the elementary school level. Another thing now, I'm going to switch lenses for a little bit to the special ed side of my background, is there are a few things that just for me as a special educator, as a former case manager, as a supervisor, that I can look at and say, hey, here's some things that I think can be done to support your child instantly, right? And we could talk about some of those things offline if you want. But I think a lot of it, again, is that preventative work, right? So we know that the trigger is A, right? How are we supporting prior to that trigger occurring, right? If she's working on an assessment, and I'm sorry, I think it's you says she's a young lady. If your child's working on an assessment, and we know oftentimes these assessments overwhelm her, right? What opportunities are we putting in place to chunk her work, right? So it might be, hey, we're going to do these set of problems first. We're going to press pause. Then we're going to come back to these set of problems. How are we preparing her for that work? Again, that's all preventative. If she is having an outburst, as you said, that's not from the way you're describing it, that's a punitive measure. I'm going to remove you from the class because you're having an outburst. As opposed to, let's sit and talk about how you're feeling, about what you're upset about how I can support you. That framework of a conversation and just what I said right there are two different lenses, right? I need you to fill out this paper because you've been bad. Versus, I see that you're having a moment. I'm going to give you a moment to de-escalate. let's do some breathing, right? Then tell me what about this assignment is frustrating you so that I can help you work through it. Now that's a learning piece for that teacher, right? Whoever that support person is, to say, I see this is what the trigger is. How am I preparing this student for this upcoming experience? Because the challenges that may be experienced right now are not going to stop next year, right? So it's all about the preventative work that's being done. That's the short answer, and it might not be the answer you want to hear. And again, we can talk after about some of the specificity of the school and some things like that. But I did want to just address your question, if that is okay.
Thank you. Yeah.
No problem.
And I appreciate the invitation to talk offline.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
And then for Mr. Cook's question, what are some of the barriers to implementing RJ? I think one of the barriers is the accountability piece, which we are working to address. Another thing that is going to be developing is every school has what they call a SIP, or a school improvement plan. And part of the school improvement plan often talks about, like, what are going to be your reading goals or your ELA goals? What are your math goals? One of the new components of the school improvement plan that I believe is going to be in place next year, don't quote me on that, is going to be, there has to be a school climate goal in the school improvement plan. This is that work of RJ, right? Like, what is going to be your school climate? How are you addressing your school climate? How are you supporting staff and supporting students to make sure they feel a part of that school community? So some of those barriers that you're mentioning, Mr. Cook, is going to be addressed through accountability, whether it be through a self-reflection rubric, but also through, now I have to track how I'm monitoring and supporting my school building. So those are some of the initial barriers. I think some of the additional barriers aside from that are helping families to see that this is valuable to all students. Oftentimes demographics play a role in programs that schools implement. And what we want schools to see is that this is not about racial demographics. This is not about disability or not. This is about every kid in the building, right? And if I'm a principal of a school, if I'm an administrator in a school, if I'm a staff member in a school, I want every kid in the building to feel comfortable. I want every kid, no matter who they are, what they look like, where they're coming from, their home life, to feel safe and secure in this school building. So a lot of times, some of those barriers come about because people feel like, oh, my building doesn't struggle with that. And then when something happens, now we're reacting, right? We're reacting to a crisis as opposed to, we should have been doing that all along. So again, trying to get schools to see the value in the work beforehand, as opposed to, now we have a problem, now I need help because I'm trying to put out a fire. Are there any, and Mr. Cook, I hope that answered your question. Are there any additional questions before we continue?
I just want to, I appreciate the response, Mr. Branch. Mm-hmm. I think as a school social worker, one of the things that I see in the school system is that when there are issues and challenges that arise, whether there's a crisis, a loss, or what have you, oftentimes students are impacted, right? They may be grieving, they may be dealing with loss, right? And one of the major things that we are coming off of is COVID, right? And it just seems and feels like we jump back right into the way that we have been doing things, like COVID never existed, right? We want to keep moving as if nothing just happened for the last 3 years. And our children, and even a lot of the adults, right, are impacted by this, and they want to act as if nothing has happened, right? We know that mental health needs are on the rise across all of our school systems and just in general. But in schools, they don't want to stop to acknowledge, right, what's going on. They don't want to have a circle to check in with their students to see how they're processing and how they're dealing, right? So I look at the adults a lot of times as one of the major challenges of doing this work, right? Because they don't want to take the time. The focus on school is academics, right? Not on wellness.
Right. And Mr. Cook, I couldn't have said it better. One of the things I often talk to staff about when I'm doing professional development sessions is that school doesn't start with the textbook. School starts with you knowing kids in your class. And you got to know who they are, You got to know what are some of the challenges they have. You got to know what their strengths are, and you got to want to know them, right? Like them sitting there saying, I'm ready, Mr. Branch. I'm ready to open my textbook. Like that's not what school is anymore. And I would say every situation I go into where it's a struggle for a teacher is because they have not developed a relationship with the kids in their class. And part of education now, right, in this century is, and in this decade is, you have to know your kids. And they got to feel like when they walk into that room, they are the apple of your eye. And sometimes teachers struggle with that because, and it's not saying you got to be their parent, but they struggle with that because that's what education is now. It's not starting with a textbook. It's not starting with solve these math problems for me or read this page. It's starting with, let me know who you are and what are some of the things you like. So that's a great point. I do know, at least in Montgomery County, one of the things that's been done to support and address that is the additional hiring of social workers. There's been more money outlined in the budget for social workers. There are also schools that have wellness trainers who go and support students as well. So the measures are being put in place to support schools, maybe not at the rate at which we would like it, but there are additional things being done. And just the last point on what Mr. Cook said, perfect example of students being impacted. At one of the schools I support, a teacher passed away. And the kids, what I did was I did what we call a grieving circle with the kids, where the kids were able to process some of those emotions because you had a teacher there on Friday, right? And then when you come back to school on Monday, they're not there anymore. And that's an adjustment. And for some of our kids, right, that revolving door of adults in their life is a real thing for them. And we did a grieving circle, and one of the kids came up to me after and said, Mr. Branch, I really appreciate you did this because it helped me understand where I am, but it also helped me to be on the lookout for signs of depression in myself or friends. And it lets me know I kind of maybe need to talk to my counselor. So again, checking in with our kids, that self-care piece, right? How do we know where they are so that they can learn? Because when other things are occupying their mind, learning is not taking place. So thank you guys for the rich discussion. And a lot of this is what you guys said is going to come up later as well in the presentation. So it's important to give honor to where this concept of restorative justice comes from. A lot of the work in community circles and building community comes from Indigenous roots, from many of the native cultures that were here in North America previously in the past. This idea of bringing the community together, right, and talking about things and coming to engaging in productive conflict resolution are Indigenous roots. And these are some of the things that we are harping back to and bringing into our schools now to create these safe spaces, these opportunities for kids to be able to speak, these opportunities for staff to be able to express what they need, these opportunities for students to say, I'm not in a good space today, right? Because again, when kids are coming to school, there might be a multitude of things that are going on. That child may not have eaten that morning. That child might have had a teacher or a friend or a classmate say something that didn't sit well with them. So bringing the people together to have these conversations and taking this whole community approach is so important. And that was, for the most part, a part of, Native tradition. So this is our continuum of what restorative justice supports look like. Again, 80 to 90% of our work is in this preventative phase. How are we developing the identity of our classroom and learning about who our kids are? How are we creating these safe learning spaces and environments? What does community building look like? How do we create this classroom culture of respect? How do we create this classroom culture of, if I'm having a moment, I know it's okay to be safe in this space and have a moment and not know and feel like I'm not going to be excluded because, as said earlier, I'm struggling with something that's a part of my disability, right? And then again, how are we bringing parents and community partners to the table to support and provide this village? All of this preventative work is so necessary. And when the preventative work is not done, we are constantly in response mode. We are constantly in this response mode because the kids feel like they have no trusted adult. The kids feel like there's nobody that looks out for them. So kids are going to do what they do best. They're going to go into that fight or flight mode, right? And again, that's when, Mr. Branch, it's a crisis here. We need you to help. And my first thing I push back is on, how did you create these preventative communities from the start? What have you done, right, leading up into this moment that lets kids know that they are safe here, lets kids know that they're not going to be excluded, that somebody's looking out for their best interests. So again, that preventative work is so powerful and so important. So there have been a lot of misconceptions, whether it be through word of mouth, whether it be through media, around what restorative justice is. And these are some of the common misconceptions around restorative justice in terms of what it is not. So oftentimes it's, oh, we're being soft and kids get to get away with it, whatever they want to do. Well, no, we're not doing that. Oftentimes when we suspend children or remove them from the classroom, the behavior and the concerns were never addressed. The harm that was done was never addressed. The triggers were never addressed. The exclusionary punitive measures addressed, but we've never solved the root cause of the problem, the root cause of the issue that child is going through. That's the work that needs to be done. Restorative justice is not something where at the end of the school year this year, yes, we're done, we finished restorative justice. No, this is something that's ongoing. Every day that a kid walks in the building, there's something that's preoccupying their mind. But we have to make sure that they are in a space to learn. And when we are not taking restorative justice for its full value, when we are not implementing it with fidelity, implementing it correctly, it's used in these formats, which gives it a bad name. The one that stands out for me, not meant to fit comfortably into our current educational system, right? That code of conduct is there, yes. But at the same time, if you've ever seen the code of conduct for Montgomery County, for any infraction at any tier, there's a bullet point that says implementation of restorative justice practices. So again, how are we implementing restorative practices to not exclude? How are we implementing restorative practices to create safe spaces? As said earlier by Ms. Hall, 2019, we had this Maryland House bill passed. And if you want to read the bill in the actual language, if you click on the link when you guys have the presentation, it'll be there. How do we avoid these exclusionary practices? Unfortunately, and this is past data, there were a large percentage of students with disabilities, students of color, who were suspended. And oftentimes it was, oh, suspension will fix it. They'll come back and they're not going to do that again. But when we send kids home, there's no conversation, there's no learning, there's no opportunity for growth. This House bill from 2019 says that's not an answer. That's not how we address challenges. How are we addressing challenges so that kids feel safe in school? How are we addressing challenges so that our staff have the capacity to support our students in any circumstance? So this law, again, is not just for Montgomery County. This is for every local school system in Maryland. So every school system, and it might not be called restorative justice, but every school system has a form of restorative practices that they are implementing to support students and avoid exclusionary practices where suspension and removal is the first approach we go to. So giving you guys an opportunity, thinking about our restorative justice or RJ word cloud here. You can feel free to come off of mute. You can put it in the chat. Is there a word or phrase here that resonates with you? Is there a word or phrase here that resonates with you? Inclusive, so important. For me, it's equity. Like, how are we creating the same opportunities for all students? Accountability, that's a good one. Repair. Working together is so important, right? That consistency from home to school and school to home is so important. Feeling heard and valued. Thank you, Melanie. So now we're going to get into a little bit of the why behind restorative justice. The concept of the school to prison pipeline is real. Oftentimes, those students who are suspended, who are removed from school, are more likely to end up in the juvenile justice system, which is the first job I actually had when I moved down to Maryland at Wax's Children's Center. It sends the message, I apologize, it sends the message that we don't want you here. It sends the message that you don't belong. African-American males, 3 times more likely to be disciplined or expelled or suspended from school. Students with disabilities, and we heard the story, 3 times more likely to be suspended, disciplined, removed from a classroom setting for the same actions of a non-disabled child, right? And a lot of those things, those gray areas, subordination, disrespect, and disruption, right? And everybody's capacity level is different. But those are not 3 reasons why a child should be removed from the classroom, right? Again, removing them from the classroom excludes them from the learning opportunity, excludes them from their peers, communicates a larger message of, you don't belong here. We can't manage you. You need more support than we can offer. And lastly, suspended students are more likely to drop out or have future encounters with law enforcement. So again, how are we building the capacity not only of our staff, but of our students? How are we creating that collaboration, that partnership to create inclusive environments, to provide opportunities for equity? So part of the RJ work that we do is dismantling this school to prison pipeline. When you think about school systems, and even Montgomery County, right, it's based on traditional values of this is how you act in class. And when you don't act the right way in class, we're going to go to this book that's going to tell us how to handle it. But how do we eliminate that approach? How do we eliminate the racial and ethnic disparities? How do we avoid or move away from this zero tolerance in approach and discipline? The criminalization of adolescent behaviors, focusing on punitive. These are all things that restorative justice is working to dismantle. And again, every school is at different places in their work with this, but there are support systems and accountability measures accountability, the word brought up earlier, that are being put in place to make sure that this is a reality across multiple school systems and not just in one school on one side of the county, for example. So this was a video that I had shared in a previous forum with MCPS staff and parents. And I want to do it again, because I think it's important. So I'm going to play this video so that you guys can see it. And it kind of speaks a little bit to this piece of disproportionality.
Listen, there's a good chance somebody's trying to hack your website.
So, any impressions of the video? Anything anybody wants to share? Something that resonated with you from the video? Whether that be you coming off of mute, whether it be going on chat in the chat. Any thoughts?
I shared a little bit about my experience with my son being suspended in elementary school, but that was back in 2015 or 16 now. And there really wasn't an in between. There's an issue, and then there's this suspension. And so to me, it seems like restorative justice, while I know it's still new and still really being implemented and baked into the system, is a mediating sort of approach that could help really sort of, allow some fairness in all of this. I know that, we still have a lot to see and see how it'll play out across the state. But that does give me a little hope, because back then there wasn't anything and nothing that parents could sort of, grab onto or suggest. At least at that time, that's how I felt as still a relatively young mom.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your personal experience.
And I agree, CP, the data is scary.
So when we think about suspensions and removals and exclusion, impact school climate and culture and student well-being, right? Like after this student is removed and just kind of tossed to the side, what is the mental status of that student? Suspensions impact access to learning, right? Again, as shared earlier, when children are removed from the classroom, they're not getting the same opportunity for the work and learning as their peers. We talked about, and I don't know who's familiar, but there were the results of the anti-racist audit from Montgomery County Public School System that came out recently. And oftentimes those perceptions around suspensions are not fair and not equitable. And then lastly, researchers found that suspensions to be ineffective, right? And they kind of fuel this school to prison pipeline. Again, it's very rare for a student to come back from suspension and say, I'm better now. Like, it doesn't work like that. That piece of suspension allows them to feel like, well, if you don't want me here, I'm gonna do things so I'm not here. And again, that's not the attitude we want from our children when they're in their school communities. This is just some data for you in terms of percentage of out-of-school suspensions. So while Montgomery County does struggle somewhat, it does have the lowest data among the 8 largest school systems in the state of Maryland. So for example, for MCPS, 1.5% of students for 160,000. And then you can kind of compare that to some of our other school systems throughout the state. And again, all of this information will be available to you in the presentation.
So what percentage of those students, do you have this broken down by race as well?
Yes, so that's actually the next slide. Perfect segment. So this was the last state report that was released. And I can show you here. This is the last state report that was released. It breaks down every county in Maryland and their suspension rates. So this is off of last school year's data. So this page that I'm sharing with you now is Montgomery County. And this is, again, lends itself to why this work of restorative practices is so important. This is number of suspensions and expulsions for the 21-22 school year, which was our first year in return to in-person learning. So in total, over 2,300 students, over 1,600 males, 790 females. It breaks it down by ethnicity. And here's this number, right? That's 739 of our students with disabilities. Again, this is something that we need to reverse. This is something that we are working with. And this is why this work of restorative practices in schools is so important to help us reverse some of these trends. One thing I think about is a couple of things looking at these categories at the top, right? So you have dangerous substances, weapons, attack threats, fighting. arson, sex offenses, disrespect and disruption, one of those gray areas we talked about, right? Again, that's subjective, depending on the teacher, depending on the relationship that student has with that teacher. Another category I look at is attack, threats, and fighting. One of the components of restorative work is conflict resolution. If I'm a student and I go to my teacher or I go to my counselor or the social worker in my building and say, hey, so-and-so have been saying things about me, or I'm not getting along with this kid, how are the adults in the building responding to that, right? How are the adults managing that? Are they saying, well, it'll be all right, just stay away from them? Or they're saying, hey, I need you to tell me a little bit about what's going on, and then bringing people to the table to discuss some of the harm that's been done. And developing a plan, essentially, that will allow people to coexist. One thing I often say, especially if I'm mediating students, is you guys don't got to walk from the table being friends. You don't got to be besties, but you guys do have to coexist. You guys do have to respect each other's spaces. So when you think about a lot of these suspensions and the reasons, right? Like, how do we get away from some of these reasons? Even looking at weapons. If I'm bringing a weapon into the building, it's something that I'm not feeling safe about, right? And is that being addressed? Is that something that is actively addressed and proactively managed within a school building? And even supporting that student and that family as well. When you think about dangerous substances, right? We know fentanyl has hit the county hard. Why are our students turning to that, right? Like, what's being done, whether it be in the school, in the community, to one, alert families and parents and students, but also to say, hey, that doesn't have to be the route you go. I'm going to come back to the presentation. There was a question that just came in the chat, so I am going to do that now. Elementary, so the question was, how is restorative justice implemented in elementary schools? This year is the first year that restorative justice has been implemented in the county at the elementary school level. One of the things that we discussed is every month, those elementary schools have restorative justice coaches on site that come to professional learning communities with myself and two colleagues, where we discuss different strategies and approaches. This year, we've kind of done it as a continuum, where first we looked at how do you create these preventative communities in terms of building community, how do you address self-care, and then we finished wrapping up how do you address conflict. One of the other things also that we talked about, the implementation of restorative work, is the reflection piece, that self-reflection rubric around what is our school doing to address some of the concerns that we see. The rubric was broken into multiple questions. So for example, it was, does our staff use restorative language around the school building? Have we informed parents, caregivers, and guardians, community members about what restorative justice is? Do we create opportunities for community building within the classroom, also outside of the school, or school-wide? Do we create opportunities for students to share when they feel like they've been harmed? One of the things that came out last year, and that's also that schools are doing individually this year, is there was a social emotional learning survey that the county asked students to complete in grades 3 and up. So in elementary school, that would be 3 through 5. And a lot of that data from that was also used to guide this work. And schools also are giving those surveys to students as well to see where are some of the additional needs of a school building as it pertains to RJ and restorative practices. This is just statewide data. So it focuses on within MCPS. Again, bullying, right? When we talk about bullying, it's why is it happening? How is it happening? How are we addressing it? Bullying is also another piece, right? Like if you have one child bullying another, are we bringing those children to the table with parental consent, with everybody agreeing to address some of the harm and the hurt that's been occurring? So within MCPS, you have numbers that are prior to the pandemic and then numbers following the pandemic. Obviously, with the 397, that was the number of cases reported, doesn't necessarily reflect the number of instances of when bullying did occur. And then you have some additional statewide data and values around things that happen as far as the amount of cases on school property, over 80%. Cyberbullying, right? We know a lot of the work now is through computers. How are we monitoring that? Where's bullying taking place at? Internet on school property, internet off school property. So all of this helps to think about the work of RJ in creating these safe spaces and safe communities for our students so that they feel welcomed into spaces, but also that they know when something has happened, I have an adult in the building I can go speak to. Another question that just came in the chat, how does RJ help young people who may not be strong communicators? One of the things that is going to come up later in this is I've worked with some elementary schools to develop a self-check-in where it can be a visual Google form that students complete that lets teachers know how they're feeling that day. So we know some of our students may not be outward verbal. Some of our students may not be strong communicators, but there should also be some kind of indication of how a student is feeling or some kind of system that allows them to communicate their needs, even if it's nonverbal. So later in the presentation, there's going to be a sample of a Google form that I created that allows students to, as almost like a check-in, or, hey, I'm in need of this right now, where they don't necessarily have to communicate it verbally, but it's something that some adults in the building can have access to support them with their needs in that time. About 2 weeks ago now, I was a part of a panel discussion at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore School of Education around restorative work and restorative practices. And the guest speaker, Dr. Thalia Gonzalez, mentioned a report from the CDC. And it talked about the social detriments of health. And this framework here talked about some of the pillars. And it was interesting to think about many of these components that are here: policy and law, data and surveillance, evaluation and evidence of building, partnerships and collaboration, community engagement, infrastructure, all contribute to social detriments of health. And they are all factors that, as caregivers, there are some that we can monitor in our home, but also as a school system that MCPS has control over, right? So that community engagement piece, how we are inviting people to the table, how we supporting families in need, partners in collaboration, evidence, right? What data and evidence do we have from our students that this is a safe building and space? What data and evidence do we have from our students that they don't feel safe in the building? Now we're looking at our infrastructure and the capacity of our teachers. What are we doing to address that? So I found this very interesting in terms of her mentioning this report from the CDC, and thought it would be something important to reference in our time together tonight. So when we think about specifically restorative justice practices as they pertain to special education students, when you think about the first component of building community, students are able to further develop their social skills and communication skills, right? We know that we're not always by our children's side, but we want them to have the capacity to be able to advocate. They're able to build positive relationships with their peers and teachers. When we think about that piece of self-care, students are able to identify and advocate for their current needs. I'm not feeling safe. I'm feeling frustrated. I'm feeling overwhelmed. I don't like it when you talk to me like that. How are we helping our kids to advocate for what they need? How are we also supporting them with self-regulation skills? How are we helping them to identify triggers? How are we managing and supporting when they feel overwhelmed, frustrated, or even overstimulated? And then lastly, how are we building in these models of conflict resolution? One of the things that was mentioned in the chat earlier by Mr. Cook was how we, as the adults in the building, modeling these things for students. Students are able to acknowledge when they've been harmed, right? I'm able to advocate and speak up, but then I'm also able to say, hey, maybe that wasn't a good decision on my part. How are we actively creating opportunities for growth and opportunities for students to be reflective in their feelings and their emotions, and how do we repair, which is one of the words that were brought up from our word cloud earlier. So now what we are going to do is we are going to engage in like a little bit of a virtual community circle activity. And what we are going to do, you can either come off a mute and say it, or you could put it in the chat. It's just an opportunity for us to, one, learn a little bit more about each other, but also it's a common way to see that a lot of our interests and concerns as caregivers, as educators, are all the same. Before we engage in any type of community circle or restorative circle, we always have our circle agreements. Circle agreements help to guide the work. So this is an example of a sample of circle agreement. Speak only when you have the talking piece. So if we were in person or in a classroom space together, there will be a talking piece and we will pass it around. When you're holding the talking piece, you share. When you're not holding the talking piece, you're just listening actively. We're demonstrating respect. That means we're not having side conversations. We're having eye contact. We're listening to understand. And then for the most part, as you guys have already been doing a great job of, is you're speaking your truth. And lastly, what's said in this space stays in this space. So those will be sample agreements that we will have in a community circle. So starting off, what we're going to do is, if people are comfortable with this, I'm going to pose the question, I'm going to ask it, and then I'm going to call the name of another participant in the meeting for them to share. When your name is called or your screen name, you can either share your answer and come off from mute, or you can put it in the chat, and then we're going to ask that you pass it to somebody else that's in the meeting. So to give you an example, I'll read the question. As stakeholders in your local school communities, what matters most to you regarding your child in school? As a stakeholder in MCPS, one thing that matters to me for any child I engage with is them feeling as if they have a voice, that somebody's listening to them and that somebody's acknowledging who they are and what support they may need. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass it to Ms. Hall with the same question. And Ms. Hall either can come off of mute, she can put it in the chat, and then she's going to pass it to somebody else.
All right. So as a stakeholder in my local school community, safety, physical safety in the building is something that matters to me.
Thank you. For those that, and sorry, Ms. Hall, for those that might not know how to pass it, if there should be a button at the bottom that says participants, and it should have like a list of people. You can just pick somebody from that list.
I was going to pass it to CP.
Thank you, Ms. Hall. What matters most to me is meaningful inclusion. And thank you. I would like to pass it to Mr. Cook.
Thank you. One of the things that matters to me most also is safety and their well-being. I'll pass it to Daria already went. Charlena.
Miss Charlena, are you there? Okay, maybe we pass it to Miss Sylvie. Miss Sylvie, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Hi, everyone. In addition to what has been said, what is also important to me when my child attends MCPS is that they enjoy the environment that they are in. I'll pass it to Mr. Scott Yearman.
I don't know if Mr. Scott is there. There's someone with an iPhone. Feel free to come off of mute to share, or you can drop your recommendation in the chat.
So what we can do is, can we pass, I think that was everybody. Oh, sorry, can we pass to Melanie?
Yes, I would reiterate what everyone else said. Safety is the most important thing. I think for me, when it comes to my child in school. And the second thing is belonging. I think with a lot of our kids who are autistic, there's this misconception that they are, not social. And I say little guy, he's not so little anymore, but he's always wanted to belong, and he's always wanted, friends and peers that make him feel like he's part of the team. And that's really a big challenge.
One thing I do want to add, iPhone added in the chat, and I just want to read it because I don't want to discredit anybody. iPhone added, what's important to me is safety in school, implementing my child's IEP, and I'm sorry, I lost it in the chat. Implementing my child's IEP, and I think and school accountability. So thank you for sharing that, iPhone. And then lastly, we'll pass it to Sue.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the thing that matters a lot, all the things people have already said matter a lot to me. The other thing that hasn't been mentioned is just feeling like someone is trying to understand my child and they're not being judged without someone making the effort to really understand why they did what they did and asking him why he did what he did before just judging harshly.
Yeah, and one thing I always say, oftentimes when we look at data, we look at like the root cause, right? So we'll say, oh, well, this child is underperforming in math or reading because, they are consistently absent, or pandemic, right? Virtual learning. But that approach, as you guys just shared, is never taken with behavior or never taken with challenges that students may encounter. It's always, oh, they messed up, we got to discipline them, as opposed to saying, hey, you had an outburst in class today. We see that every time we get ready to engage in this activity, you respond this way. Let's talk about the why, right? So that root cause analysis for behavior is so important. And I think also differentiating that behavior is not always harmful. Behavior is a reaction because that our bodies are conditioned to. And sometimes it takes a little work to understand that, but that's the work that's necessary. That's the work that's important to engage in the why of something that happens. So when we think about restorative discipline, it can't be the approach of one teacher in the classroom. And thank you guys all for participating. It can't be the approach of one teacher in the classroom. It can't be the approach of a grade level. It has to be a whole school approach. And the focus of this approach, when we talk about restorative discipline, has to be, what are my relationships like with the student? What is our building school culture and climate? And how are we proactively addressing student behavior to not foster a culture of exclusion? How are we valuing social engagement and accountability over punishment? And oftentimes we jump to punishment because it's easy. Punishment is almost like a version of fast food in the school world. It's quick, it's easy, it's filling in the moment, right? Sending that kid away is like, oh, we got rid of the problem. It's more meaningful to engage in the why again as to why this is happening and develop supports over time, as opposed to, I'm just going to remove you because you're the problem. When we think about a restorative mindset, how are relationships and trust at the center of our school community, of our classroom community? How are members of the community responsible to one another, right? We think about, as a student in this classroom, how am I responsible to my teachers and to my peers? As a teacher in this classroom, how am I responsible to my students beyond just teaching them the work? How are we opening multiple perspectives? How are we saying, hey, I saw that today was a rough day for you. Talk to me about why today was a rough day for you, as opposed to jumping to judgment. How are we using healing, which was mentioned earlier in the chat? How are we using healing as a process? How are we differentiating harm? As teachers, when our pride is hurt, when our ego is not uplifted, we consider that harm, but that's not harm. And a lot of times it's hard for teachers to differentiate that sense of pride and ego from real harm. So again, if there is true harm, if there are hurtful words being used, if there's physical altercations, that's harm. But a student making a comment or a student telling us how they feel doesn't mean that that's harm. And then lastly, how are we proactively addressing conflict in a peaceful way so that kids don't feel like I got to do this on my own and use my hands? How are we using proactive measures to address conflict to create peaceful resolutions? So oftentimes when I'm working with students or even, supporting families individually, I like to use these 4 approaches in thinking about working with students. Number 1, if we're responding to a behavior, is this behavior causing harm? So I reference back to CP, right? Child has a moment in class, an outburst. Is that harm, right? Is that hurting somebody, right? So that's the first question you got to ask. Is this behavior causing harm? Number 2, will addressing the issue immediately escalate or de-escalate the situation? There are some moments that things and incidents that need to be handled in the moment. There are others where I'm going to give you a mindful moment because I see that you need to breathe a little bit. How does addressing this situation in the moment help or not help? Number 3, and this is where our adults come in. Is the behavior threatening my power? So I think about, again, the example with CP, an outburst may feel like a teacher may feel like I don't have control of my class, right? So how is this behavior? Is the behavior threatening power? And are we able to say that this is not my classroom as the adult, but this is our classroom for teacher and student? And also this concept of UPR or unconditional positive regard. How am I addressing my children, my students every day, no matter what happened the day before, no matter what happened in the morning, no matter what happened in the afternoon? Am I giving them that unconditional positive regard and not holding these judgments, not holding these, you didn't behave today, so I got to treat you a little bit differently? And then lastly, when dealing with challenging behaviors, is the mindset to determine consequences and say, how do I root this problem out? Or how do I build capacity of children, build their toolkit to have a productive dialogue around, talk to me about what's going on? Those approaches are completely different. And it's important that we're using the latter of that relationship and restoring piece to make sure that we're hearing our children and what they need. Are there any questions? Any questions?
Mr. Branch, I do have a question.
Yes.
So often I think bullying is unfortunately, it happens so much specifically to autistic students because it just is so challenging for them to, communicate and understand sometimes when even if they're being bullied. So but the times that this has happened, and speaking from our own experience, and a bullying incident has been reported to the school and it's reached that level. So often the way it is dealt with is by talking to every party individually and separately and not allowing communication between the parties and sort of advising the student, my son, don't interact, stop, avoid this person, don't talk, we'll handle it. And there does, I'm just wondering about your building relationships. That part seems left out of the process because he's just learning that I have to end these relationships rather than making it, a learning moment for both parties. Can you just comment on how we can move away from, I understand confidentiality and everything, but that seems to be a real obstacle as well in being able to get everyone to communicate.
So best practice says, if there's an incident between two students and one student has bullied another, obviously there's the report filled out. There is, the bullying, harassment, intimidation form filled out. And essentially, you're gonna, speak to or interview the student who was, the harmed, and then the student who was the harm doer. And the goal is essentially, if parents consent and the students feel comfortable, that we need to be bringing those students together to talk about this harm that has occurred, because it's something in the power of a student who's been harmed to advocate and share how they've been harmed to the person who's done harming. And again, that's not a forced process, because it also can be traumatic, right? When you're forcing me to sit across the table from somebody that did something that wasn't nice to me. So that's why I talk about that piece of consent with not only the students, but also with the parents. That's important. And that's why these forums like this are important, because I know I can speak for myself. My third grader had an incident in school where a kid hit him. And, they told me to stay away from him, Daddy. Yeah, no, we're not doing that. Like, because you guys are in the same class. How you staying away from each other? Right. So it was, hey, can you speak to my son about what happened? Speak to the other student. And I would love for them to sit together and be able to kind of talk about what happened. And if necessary, meet the family of the other child. Because again, it's that communication piece that's necessary to make sure that everybody's on the same page. It's also that communication piece that's necessary to ensure that we are rooting out what's happening, as opposed to saying you guys play on opposite sides of the playground. And again, it's something powerful about a child saying, when you said this to me, when you did that to me, when you hit me, or whatever the case is, I didn't appreciate that. I didn't like it because. And it makes a difference when somebody who's doing harm is able to hear that, versus an adult telling them, oh, so-and-so said you made them feel like this. So Melanie, I hope that answers your question around what is best practices for schools in terms of bringing people together to the table to share how they've been impacted by encounter, by experience.
Yes, thank you so much.
No problem. We've had a lot of rich discussion and some really good questions. I know we are up against time. So I'm going to share this slide and then kind of move more to like the pieces around some tips for parents at home and some resources. When we think about restorative versus punitive, we're thinking about how can we create these safe environments for our students, and also ensuring that there are fair consequences aligned that represent positive school culture, climate, and well-being. An example of a contract might be here. So for example, going off the example Melanie just said, early in the year, I had an instance where I had to bring two kids together where one was bullying the other. We talked about the harm that was being done. We talked about why it's not safe, how it makes a student feel. And we implemented contracts where when you guys are in the same spaces coexisting, and if you guys choose to engage with one another, here's the stipulations of what you're going to follow. Here's what you're agreeing to. And these are contracts. I still go to that school today and meet with them, check in with them every 2 weeks to see how the contract is going, how we are abiding by agreements. These agreements are important because they are student-led agreements, right? Of course, as the adults, we're going to have some input in it. But at the end of the day, we want to have students have a voice in what are things that they're going to do to best be citizens in that school and classroom community. This next slide just gives an example of a consent form. So again, before we bring parties to the table, we want to make sure we have permission, right? It can be very traumatic to have to sit across and engage in a conversation with somebody who did something harmful to you. So we want to make sure that we have parental and student consent. This just talks about some of the gains that have been made across MCPS in math and reading by keeping our kids in the classroom, right? Making sure that they're not excluded. This is an example of a scenario. I'll just put it up here and then give a very generic idea of way this can be managed. And then we'll go into the resources for parents and take any last questions. Jason arrives to class. When he arrives, the class has already begun their warm-up. Teacher asks Jason to take out his homework and immediately gets to work. Teacher approaches the student and makes the request for a second time. After the second request, the student begins loudly screaming and elopes from class, right? So again, as a teacher, what is my relationship with Jason? I made the request the first time. He didn't do it. So now for me, I'm not going to push this, right? I'm not going to go to Jason the second time and say, take it out. We need to catch you up. It's about, hey, Jason, are you okay? What's going on? Let's take a minute to talk. Again, this is where that relationship piece comes into play, because the punitive measure is, well, he walked out of class, he's screaming, he doesn't get recess today. He's going to have lunch detention, right? With that punitive measure, with that exclusionary practice, we've never figured out why Jason was managing himself this morning in this way. All we've done is said, Jason, we can't manage you, so now we got to discipline you. The bigger piece is, if Jason comes in feeling like this the next day, have we talked about strategies to de-escalate? Have we supported that teacher in recognizing these signs for Jason? Have we given Jason strategies to advocate and say, I'm having a rough morning, I need to talk to so-and-so. I'm having a rough morning, can I get him in? So again, it's about the restorative approaches to situations of this nature, that we don't want to provide punitive measures where you've eloped, now we got to discipline you. It's about, why did you elope? Is there something that could have been done to keep you in the classroom to meet your needs of self-care in that moment? So now is our portion where we will kind of build this bridge to home, and talk about what are some tips and resources. One of the things that we always want to do, going back to the title, those win-win situations, anything that's positive, celebrate it. Whether it be something that you see at home, whether it be in terms of an IEP, making gains on the IEP and making goals. I just had an IEP meeting for my older son yesterday, and it talked about his gains in reading. So anything that we can celebrate is a win, and we want to make sure we highlight those. Engaging in conversation, any opportunities we get. How was your day? What went well? What would you improve? What are your relationships like with your friends and your teachers, right? Listening, whether it be school walks, car rides, shared interests, any of those opportunities to talk and build relationships, to get our kids to express what's going on, is always, always, always a win. And we know oftentimes with our kids, they speak when they're comfortable. So we know that that might not be the case in school. So we can do that as parents, creating these opportunities for them to feel comfortable and share, because we know the older they get, the less comes out. So we want to make sure that these are constant practices that are used to make sure that our kids are sharing what's going on when we're not with them. Accurately acknowledging emotions, frustration, anger, excitement, joy, all natural human emotions, right? It's okay to be frustrated. It's okay to be overwhelmed. It's okay to be excited. But how do we acknowledge that? How do we manage that? And what supports and systems are we instilling in our kids, but also passing on to the teachers? This is why this work at home is so critical, because if we can start to develop some strategies with our kids, they can say, hey, me and mom or me and dad at home, we work on this. I need this. I need to do this right now. Can I have a moment, right? Again, how are we supporting our kids to build their capacity, not just for the moment, but for moving forward? Also working to identify problems. Your child might come home and say, hey, so-and-so did this to me. Let's talk about how that made you feel. When they said that about you, when they excluded you from playing today during recess at soccer, how did that make you feel? And then let's practice scenarios. Let's practice models of how do we solve this? Being reflective and transparent when harm does happen. How do we have those difficult conversations with our kids? And then the biggest thing for us as parents is how are we reflective and not reactive? A lot of times I get a phone call that says, Mr. Branch, your son was chatty today, right? The easy thing for me to say is, you were chatty today, you know, this is the consequence, as opposed to let's talk about why you're being chatty in class. What's happening? Maybe are your needs not being met at that time? Maybe you asked for something and it wasn't given. So how are we as parents, caregivers, and guardians being reflective as opposed to reactive? Just some parenting tips, things that we can take away and implement in our daily practices as parents and caregivers. How do we create these collaborative agreements with our children around chores and homework and dinner time and expectations? How do we allow our children to have a voice in decisions that are made that impact them? How are we capitalizing on opportunities for conversations, tapping into thoughts, tapping into emotions, capitalizing on moments when they want to speak? I know when I get home and with my kids and it's dishes, dinner, laundry, right? But how are we taking opportunities to press pause on some of those things Because one thing that I've realized, and you guys probably noticed, when your child comes to talk to you, that's the most important thing on their heart and their mind at that time. So how are we creating these opportunities to give them the floor and give them our undivided attention? And then lastly, how are we using restorative practices at home, right? Creating opportunities for learning and growth when we do have to discipline. It's easy to say, go sit in your room and close the door, no TV, no electronics, right? But is that creating opportunities for learning? Having conversation around harm that has happened. How are we creating these opportunities that says, let's talk about what happened? And the biggest and most important thing is how we denouncing actions and not the person. Oftentimes, our kids, they struggle separating the two. I was disappointed in the choice you made, not disappointed in who you are. So that's important also to highlight that for our kids. As we come to a close and think about some restorative practices that we've discussed, is there one commitment that anyone can see that they feel they can start implementing at home or continue to implement at home that they've already been doing? For this, you can come off of mute and share it aloud. You can put it in the chat. Whatever you feel comfortable doing, please feel free to share. What is one commitment you can engage in at home around restorative justice practices, or one thing that you're already doing that you want to continue because you see a value in it?
I can share a mistake that I was making that I stopped making. And I was, I have one who struggles to communicate and reflect on her day. And all I wanted to know when she got home was how her day was. So I peppered her with questions when she was already exhausted. When I stopped doing that and just made her feel good to be home, she gradually started to volunteer more things that she remembered about her day, that were meaningful things that she really wanted to talk about. And I let her drive it, and it's made a huge difference for us. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. That was so powerful. Listening to my child choosing words carefully. Yeah, that's so important, right? We might say a bunch of things to our kids, but they remember what they want to hear. And they remember those pertinent words. So making sure that we're choosing words wisely is so important. Anything else, whether you want to come off of mute or put it in the chat? Affirming feelings, that's important too. Oftentimes we want to, shy away from certain feelings, but all of those feelings are important because it's the makeup of our child. So it's important that we acknowledge every feeling that they might be experiencing and openly talking about it. That's important. So the last part of this presentation, as we begin to wrap up, is just some resources for home, things you guys can utilize, things you can take away. This is what I talked about earlier, a check-in. If you know that there's a little bit of a struggle with the relationship building with your child and their teacher, this might be something you want to implement. I'll just show one sample. So a morning check-in, right? Like when kids arrive in the building, how are they feeling? It's not very wordy, very, student-friendly visuals. How do I feel today, right? And students can check how they feel. I really like my friends, my classroom, my school. When I do good things today, I want a high five, a shout out, a phone call home, a prize, and then anything else. So this is important, right? We want our students to feel like they're part of the community. We want our teachers to know their kids, but we also want to let them know that when you do something good, I'm going to recognize you, right? So something like this can be very valuable for a classroom setting to support teachers with learning the interests of their children. There's another one that's grades 3 through 5, and then there's also a secondary one as well. Mindfulness. Sometimes we have to support our kids in taking a step back and support them with just taking a deep breath. So when we think about a mindful snack, it's an acronym. So SNACK stands for stop, notice, accept, curious, and kindness, right? That stop, am I processing what's happening around me? What do I notice? What can I accept in this moment? What am I curious about? How am I responding from a place of kindness? So also, this is something that can be utilized by teachers, something that can be a classroom approach, something that can help our students to self-regulate when they see things happening around them that they're not comfortable with. This resource here is from the Crisis Prevention Institute. They're the top 10 de-escalation techniques. When you click on the link at the top, it takes you to the actual page and it gives you a description of each one. It might be really important, and this is something you could work on with your children. Pick 2 that they feel comfortable with. See what they feel comfortable with, see what works for them. And then again, this is something that can start at home and then translate to school. And once you know a strategy that works for them, letting their teacher know, hey, we've been working on personal space, right? And when they're upset, they need personal space. How does our children communicate that? But also, how do we advocate for our kids so that their teachers are aware of that as well? So feel free to peruse this when you have an opportunity. These are effective questions, and these are questions that can be used to support students when things have happened. This is also questions that we use with staff, MCPS staff, when they are processing or supporting students with processing a situation. So when challenging behaviors happen, what were you thinking? What have you thought about since? Who was affected? What do we need to do to make things right? To help those affected. What do you think happened? What did you realize what was happening? What impact did this have on you? What has been the hardest thing for you? What do you think needs to happen to make things right? So again, these are questions that can be used to help students process a situation and help them feel a little bit more comfortable sharing without it being too evasive. Some additional reading materials around restorative justice and how it specifically pertains to special needs students. When you click on the link, it will take you to some articles that have come out. I really like the third one, an inclusive approach, and how do we meet the needs of diverse learners and diverse students. So these are things that you can reference later on your own time. And then another reference of a take-home guide. So what are how can we implement circles at home, and what are some of the benefits? And this is all outlined here on this handout. As we know, routines are so important. And their different routines at home also can support routines in the classroom, and vice versa. And then lastly, this is specific to MCPS. Again, here's that take-home flyer. As restorative justice, we do have a Canvas page for parents. You do have to be an MCPS parent to be able to log in and have access, because it's linked through Synergy. So if you're an MCPS parent, you can join the Canvas page. We do have an RJ website. And then we also have Instagram and Twitter, where we talk about some of the things that we're doing in school. So you can follow us as well. And then we want to close out with, we mentioned this earlier, that respond instead of react piece. When a situation occurs, consider the following. Am I responding from a place of support to promote growth, or am I reacting to the behavior with the sole purpose of disciplining? And I'm going to challenge you guys. That is a big question and a big statement that we can push back to schools, right? When something happens with my child, how are you promoting their growth as opposed to looking at the best way to discipline them? And then lastly, responding to a situation brings about change. As parents, caregivers, and guardians, we got to be consistent. And we're the biggest advocates for our kids. Reacting to behavior causes fear and emotional escalation that can quickly get out of control. So again, how are we responding to a situation as opposed to, this is the hammer that's coming down to manage this situation. As we close out, building relationships with students is by far the most important thing a teacher can do. Without a solid foundation of relationships built on trust and respect, no quality learning will happen. I want to thank you guys for your engagement. Thank you for your participation. Thank you for your questions, right? And just your willingness to engage in some things that are a little personal. Hopefully this was a safe space that you guys felt you were safe in to talk to some of the points on here. I can stick around for a little bit to take additional questions, concerns. As was shared in the chat, the video will be shared out, the link will be shared out. I'm going to put my phone number and email in the chat again. So if anybody wants to reach out, if anybody wants to, brainstorm next steps.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Branch. We really appreciate your time and your energy and your care in response to our questions and learning more about restorative justice. I think we are all better aware now of the benefits and realize that it might take some time for it to really see effects from it. But it's a resource nonetheless for parents to be able to use. Thank you to our parents and caregivers for joining us today and for your time and energy and attention. Please do continue to follow us. There are more events in the pipeline. xminds.org is where you can go to get these resources. Mr. Branch's contact information is in the chat again, in case you would like to reach out for a one-to-one conversation. But again, we appreciate your time and your attention and your advocacy, and we wish you all a good evening.